Picture a classroom built for 30 children. Now picture it with 8. That's not a hypothetical. In parts of South Korea today, that's simply what an elementary school looks like, if it hasn't already closed entirely. South Korea's birth rate isn't just low. It's the lowest ever recorded for any country in modern history, lower than nations that lived through actual famine or war. On average, a Korean woman today has fewer than one child in her lifetime. To put that in perspective, a country needs roughly 2.1 children per woman just to keep its population stable over time without relying on immigration. South Korea isn't just below that number. It's less than half of it. So, how does one of the wealthiest, most technologically advanced countries on Earth end up with the most severe demographic collapse ever documented? The answer isn't that people don't want children. Surveys consistently show most young Koreans say they'd like to have kids someday. The answer is that the actual conditions for having them have, quietly, systematically, become almost impossible for an enormous share of the population. Let's start with the most obvious pressure: money. Raising a child in South Korea is extraordinarily expensive, not because of basic necessities, but because of what having a child is now widely expected to include. Private after-school academies, called hagwons, aren't optional extras here. They're treated as close to mandatory because entrance into the country's small number of elite universities can determine an entire career trajectory. Economist Yoon Chung Kim has estimated that Korean families routinely spend a significant share of household income on private education alone, starting in early childhood and rarely letting up until university admission. Now add housing. Seoul is one of the most expensive cities in the world relative to local income, and a huge share of the country's population and economic opportunity is concentrated there. A young couple might spend a decade or more simply saving toward a down payment on an apartment large enough for a family, all while working some of the longest average hours among wealthy nations. Picture that math concretely. You're working late most evenings, your income is being stretched between rent and savings, and even if you clear those hurdles, the moment you have a child, you're expected to immediately start budgeting for hagwon fees that could rival a second mortgage. Here's where the story gets more complicated than simple economics. Sociologist Cho Eun-chung has pointed to something less visible than the cost calculations: a stalled gender revolution. Korean women have made enormous gains in education, now outpacing men in university enrollment, and have entered the workforce in record numbers. But traditional expectations around housework, childcare, and career sacrifice at home have not caught up nearly as fast. Survey after survey shows Korean women still perform a dramatically larger share of unpaid domestic labor than men, even in households where both partners work full-time. Picture what that tension actually looks like inside one household. A woman finishes a full workday, comes home, and is still expected to manage the majority of childcare, cooking, and household logistics, largely alone. Meanwhile, taking parental leave, especially for men, can still carry real career penalties in many Korean workplaces, where visible presence and long hours remain closely tied to promotion. Faced with that reality, an increasing number of Korean women are making a rational, if quietly devastating decision: not having children at all, or having exactly one. Rather than absorbing a burden the system was never built to share evenly. This is the counterintuitive twist worth sitting with. South Korea didn't get here through poverty or instability. It got here partly because of its own success. The same intense competitive culture that produced world-class companies, elite universities, and rapid economic growth also produced a society where the perceived cost of raising a child successfully, measured against strict social expectations of what successfully even means, has become almost impossibly high for many families to justify. The government has noticed, and the numbers show why it's alarmed. Over the past 2 decades, various administrations have spent well over $200 billion combined on programs meant to encourage childbirth, including cash subsidies, expanded parental leave, and childcare support. The birth rate kept falling anyway. Demographer Cho Young-tae has argued that cash incentives alone rarely fix a problem this structural, because they don't address the underlying conditions, housing costs, education pressure, workplace culture, and gender inequity that make parenthood feel unsustainable in the first place. Picture the long-term consequence if this trend continues largely unchanged. Fewer children today means a shrinking workforce in 20 years, fewer taxpayers supporting a rapidly aging population, and eventually entire regions of the country facing depopulation. Some rural areas are already seeing schools close for lack of students, hospitals scale back maternity wards for lack of demand, and local economies contract as young people concentrate in a handful of major cities, leaving the countryside older and emptier by the year. Military planners have even begun openly discussing what a shrinking pool of young men might eventually mean for a country that still maintains mandatory conscription along a heavily fortified border. There is also a quieter, more personal layer to this story that statistics alone don't fully capture. Many young Koreans describe feeling caught between 2 versions of a good life that no longer seem compatible. The version their parents' generation pursued, built around marriage, children, and long hours at a stable company, and a newer version built around personal fulfillment, career achievement, and financial independence that leaves little obvious room for the first. Rather than compromise on either, a growing number are simply opting out of the marriage and childbearing track altogether, not out of resentment, but because trying to hold both visions together, under the country's current economic and social conditions, feels less like ambition and more like an impossible math problem with no clean solution. So picture the full arc, side by side. A Hagwon classroom lit up until midnight, chasing a university spot that determines everything that comes after it. A young couple calculating, almost like an engineering problem, whether they can afford both an apartment and a child on their combined income. A woman quietly deciding that having one child, or none, is the only way to protect a career and a sense of self inside a system that still expects her to carry most of the load at home. An elementary school in a shrinking town, half empty, waiting to see if it will still have enough students to justify staying open next year. Here's what this reflects back on you. It's tempting to treat a falling birth rate as a simple lifestyle choice, as if an entire generation just decided individually that children weren't worth it. The more honest picture is less comfortable. What's happening in South Korea looks less like personal preference and more like a society running an accidental, decades-long experiment in exactly how much pressure a population can absorb, economically and socially, before it quietly stops reproducing itself at all. You started this looking at a classroom built for 30 children and occupied by 8. Now you know that empty space isn't really about people who stopped wanting kids. It's about a system that, without quite meaning to, made having them feel like something fewer and fewer people could reasonably afford to choose.